The number you keep seeing when you're living the wrong life. There is a moment when 111 stops feeling random. You glance at a clock. It reads 111. Minutes later, a receipt, a license plate, a notification timestamp echoes the same digits back at you. You laugh it off the first time. By the third time in 1 week, you stop laughing. It tends to happen on the days when something inside you feels quietly wrong. Not sick, not dramatic, just off, as if you are living someone else's schedule inside your own body. You have been ignoring that feeling for a while, telling yourself it is normal to feel numb during a busy season. But the number keeps returning, and so does the feeling, and part of you suspects they are connected. Here is the first layer of the answer. This number tends to surface when a person is living a life built from decisions that were never fully their own. Not a life that is failing on paper, a life that works and still feels like the wrong one. That much is true, but it is only the surface. There is a second layer underneath it, about why this exact signal and why it starts now instead of years ago. That is where this gets specific. The life that works on paper and still feels wrong. Nobody warns you that a wrong life can look identical to a right one from the outside. The job title sounds respectable. The relationship photographs well. The apartment has good light in the mornings. Everything checks a box someone else handed you years ago. And yet you wake up some days with a strange heaviness that has no clear source. You are not sick. Nothing dramatic has happened. There is simply a low hum of disconnection underneath the ordinary tasks of the day, like static behind a radio station that is technically still playing. Most people never name that hum. They call it stress or tiredness or a phase that will pass once the next milestone arrives. So they push through, collect the milestone, and feel the same static waiting for them on the other side. This is the quiet kind of wrong life. Not a collapse, not a scandal. Just a slow accumulation of choices that were reasonable at the time and never quite belonged to you. Maybe you chose the career path because it pleased a parent or avoided a fight, or matched what a version of you once believed success should look like. Maybe you chose the relationship because it was steady, and steady felt like enough at 23. None of those choices were wrong in the moment. That is what makes them so hard to question later. And this is where most people misread what is happening to them. They assume the discomfort means something is broken in them, some flaw in their own capacity for gratitude. So they try harder to appreciate what they have, which only pushes the real signal further underground. The truth is less personal and more structural. A life assembled from other people's expectations can function perfectly and still generate a persistent, low-grade sense of exile from your own experience. You can be surrounded by evidence of success and still feel like a guest in your own biography. That feeling does not stay silent forever. At some point, it starts looking for a way to get your attention. For a growing number of people, it finds that way through a number. Not because the number holds mystical authority on its own, because the mind reaches for pattern when logic keeps getting waved away. A recurring number becomes a kind of external alarm clock for an internal truth that has been ignored one too many times. That is the layer we are opening next. Not just that this happens, but exactly what the number is trying to say, and why it chose now to say it. Why this exact number keeps finding you. The number is 111. Not 444, not 717, not any of the other patterns people talk about online. Specifically 111, arriving in clocks, receipts, addresses, and timestamps. Almost always during the moments when the static described a minute ago is loudest. In numerology, 1 carries the meaning of initiation. A single 1 marks a beginning. 3 of them stacked together intensify that meaning into something closer to an alarm. Not gentle nudging. A direct signal that a starting point has already opened, whether or not you have consciously stepped through it. That distinction matters. 111 rarely shows up to announce an ending. It shows up to announce that a new beginning has quietly become available. That timing usually arrives right around the moment a person has stopped believing another version of their life was even possible. Here is where most people misread the timing. They assume the number should have appeared earlier, back when the wrong choice was first being made. But that is not how the pattern tends to work. Synchronicity researchers, following the framework Carl Jung first proposed, describe these events as meaningful coincidences that surface when the unconscious mind is ready to integrate something the conscious mind has been avoiding. You were not ready earlier. The version of you making that first compromise needed it, for reasons that made sense at the time. The number arrives now because now is when a different response has become available to you. There is also a psychological layer running underneath the mystical one. Repetition creates salience. Once your brain registers 111 as meaningful, it starts flagging every future instance, a mechanism researchers call the frequency illusion. That does not make the pattern fake. It means your own attention has become a partner in surfacing something real that was already asking to be noticed. Both explanations can be true at once. The spiritual layer says a beginning has opened. The psychological layer says your mind is finally paying attention to evidence it used to filter out. Together they explain why the timing feels so exact, almost too exact to be coincidence, even to people who do not consider themselves particularly spiritual. What the number is not doing is punishing you for the wrong life you built. It is not judgment. It functions closer to a doorframe appearing in a wall that seemed solid a week ago. The next question is harder than simply recognizing the pattern. It is understanding how a person ends up this far from their own life in the first place, and why that process is so difficult to notice while it is happening. How a person ends up living a life they never chose. Nobody sits down at 18 and deliberately designs a life that will feel wrong 20 years later. The wrong life is built one reasonable decision at a time, each one small enough to seem harmless in isolation. You take the safer major because the interesting one worried your family. You take the job offer that came first instead of the one you actually wanted, because waiting felt risky. You stay in the relationship a little longer than your gut suggested, because leaving would have disappointed people you loved. Each decision viewed alone looks like maturity. The trouble is that these decisions compound. A career chosen for safety leads to a lifestyle built around that career. That lifestyle attracts friends who reinforce the same values. Those friendships make it socially costly to question the original choice later, even quietly, even just to yourself. By the time the wrongness becomes obvious, the architecture around it is already extensive. Undoing one piece threatens to destabilize the mortgage, the marriage, the professional identity, the whole visible structure of an adult life. So most people do not undo it. They adjust their expectations instead and call that wisdom. There is a detail in this process that most people never examine closely, and it changes how the whole pattern should be understood. The compromises rarely feel like compromises in the moment. They feel like love or responsibility or simple practicality. Nobody experiences the early choices as betrayal of themselves. That is precisely what makes the pattern so hard to catch early. Developmental psychologists sometimes describe this as identity foreclosure, a term for committing to a life direction before genuinely exploring the alternatives, often to avoid the discomfort of uncertainty. It is efficient. It is also how a perfectly functional adult can end up decades into a life that technically belongs to someone else's blueprint. There is nothing shameful in this. Almost everyone does some version of it because uncertainty is genuinely uncomfortable, and certainty, even borrowed certainty, is genuinely soothing. The problem only becomes visible once the soothing stops working, which tends to happen quietly, in ordinary weeks without any single dramatic trigger. That is usually the exact window when 111 starts appearing. Not at the moment of the original compromise. At the moment the compromise finally stops being able to hide itself from you. Understanding how you got here is useful, but it only explains the past. What explains the present is a mechanism just as invisible as the one that built the wrong life in the first place, and it deserves its own close look. The autopilot. Nobody warns you about. There is a specific mental state where a person can perform an entire day competently without being emotionally present for any of it. Psychologists sometimes call it dissociative functioning, though most people simply call it autopilot. You answer the emails, you attend the meeting, you make dinner, help with homework, respond to texts, and go to sleep. From the outside, nothing looks wrong. From the inside, very little of it was actually experienced. It was executed. Autopilot is not laziness and it is not depression, although the two can overlap. It is closer to a protective adaptation. When a life contains too much unresolved discomfort, the mind quietly reduces how much of that life it lets you feel, so you can keep functioning without being overwhelmed by the mismatch. This is efficient in the short term. It is also exactly why a wrong life can persist for years without triggering an obvious crisis. The discomfort never accumulates to a breaking point because the mind keeps siphoning it off in small, manageable amounts day after day, quietly enough that you never notice the total. And here is the detail almost nobody catches in time. Autopilot does not just numb the pain of the wrong life. It numbs your access to the parts of yourself that would recognize the right one. The same mechanism that protects you from disappointment also blocks you from desire, curiosity, and instinct, because all three require a level of presence Autopilot is specifically designed to avoid. This is why people in this state often describe feeling neither happy nor sad, just flat. Flatness is not the absence of emotion. It is the cost of suppressing emotion evenly across an entire life, so no single feeling gets loud enough to demand a response. Synchronicities like 1 in 11 tend to cut through flatness in a way ordinary thoughts cannot. A recurring number is external. It does not require you to access buried feelings directly. It simply interrupts the autopilot loop with a pattern too specific to file away as noise, which is exactly why it works when internal reflection has repeatedly failed. The number is not curing the numbness. It is puncturing it briefly, just enough for a flicker of the original feeling underneath to surface before autopilot resumes. Those flickers matter more than they seem to in the moment. They are the closest thing available to direct evidence that the wrong life is not the only life still available to you. What comes next looks closely at exactly when those flickers tend to appear. The moments right before it appears. People who track when 1 in 11 shows up notice a pattern once they pay attention. It rarely appears during ordinary, uneventful hours. It clusters around specific kinds of moments, and those moments are worth naming precisely. The first is the decision point. A choice is sitting in front of you, usually a small one on the surface. It might be whether to take a call, accept an invitation, or say yes to another obligation you do not have room for. Right before you default to the automatic answer, the number appears, almost like a hand on the shoulder asking you to actually look at the choice instead of sleepwalking through it. The second is the comparison moment. You see someone else's life, in person or online, living with a kind of openness or freedom your own life does not currently contain. A small ache follows. That ache is honest information about a gap between where you are and where some part of you still wants to be. The number tends to surface right there inside that ache before you can talk yourself out of feeling it. The third is the quiet moment. Not a crisis, not a big life event, just an ordinary pause, a drive home, a few minutes before sleep, a walk with no destination. These are the moments when autopilot briefly loosens its grip because there is nothing urgent left to perform. The number often chooses exactly this stillness to appear, as if it has been waiting for a gap wide enough to get through. Here is the detail that changes how most people interpret this. The number is not causing these moments. The moments are the ones where you are already, briefly, close enough to your own experience for the pattern to register at all. On a fully numbed, fully scheduled day, you might walk past 100 instances of 111 and never once notice, which means the frequency of the sightings follows a clear cause. It is a rough measure of how often you are actually present enough in your own life to catch what has likely been available all along. That availability was never really the rare part. This reframes the entire experience. The number was never the rare event. Your presence was the rare event, and the number simply became visible whenever presence happened to occur, week after week, in plain sight, waiting for a gap wide enough to be noticed. Understanding this shifts the question. It is no longer only why the number appears. It becomes why presence itself has become so difficult to access, which is where fear enters the picture directly. Fear dressed up as practicality. If misalignment is so uncomfortable and the signs of it so persistent, a fair question follows. Why does anyone stay in a wrong life once they can clearly feel it is wrong? The honest answer is fear, though it rarely introduces itself using that word. Fear in adulthood is fluent in disguise. It speaks in the voice of responsibility. It sounds reasonable, measured, even wise. It says things like, "This is not the right time," or "Think about the people who depend on you," or "Plenty of people never feel fully aligned and they manage fine." Every one of those sentences can be true in isolation. The trouble is that fear uses them selectively, only ever in the direction of staying, never in the direction of examining whether staying is actually serving anyone. Consider how differently the same caution gets applied. Nobody frames taking a big promotion as reckless even though it carries real risk. Nobody calls a sudden move for a relationship impractical, even though it upends an entire routine. Practicality, it turns out, is usually reserved for decisions that keep the current structure intact and quietly abandoned for decisions that expand it. That asymmetry is the signature of fear operating under a more respectable name. Real practicality weighs costs in both directions equally. Fear only ever weighs the cost of change and stays conveniently blind to the cost of continuing exactly as things are. And the cost of continuing is rarely dramatic enough to force a reckoning on its own. A wrong life does not usually collapse in one visible moment. It erodes quietly, in missed years, in a slow narrowing of what still feels possible, in relationships that stay comfortable because nobody involved is being fully honest anymore. This is precisely the gap 111 tends to step into. Not to demand an immediate sweeping change, but to interrupt fear's monopoly on the conversation for just long enough that a more honest voice gets a turn to speak. That interruption does not feel like courage in the moment. It usually feels like doubt, or restlessness, or an inconvenient question arriving at an inconvenient time. Courage tends to be a description applied afterward, once the honest voice has actually been followed, instead of overruled again. Recognizing fear's disguise is only the first defense against it. The next layer is harder to argue with logically, because it does not speak in sentences at all. It speaks through the body, in a language most people were never taught to read, and it has been speaking for far longer than the mind has been willing to admit. What your body already knows. Long before a person can articulate that their life feels wrong, the body has usually been reporting it for months, sometimes years, in a language most people were never taught to read. Chronic tightness across the shoulders that no amount of stretching resolves. A jaw that clenches during ordinary conversations. A stomach that reacts to certain rooms, certain meetings, certain names, with a tension that has no obvious external cause. These are not scattered malfunctions. They are data, arriving with real consistency. Somatic researchers describe the body as keeping a running account of experiences the conscious mind has not yet processed, sometimes summarized in the phrase "the body keeps score." A wrong life, sustained long enough, produces exactly the kind of chronic low-grade threat signal this research describes. Part of you is registering the mismatch even while the rest of you insists everything is fine. This explains something that puzzles a lot of people. Why can a person feel physically exhausted despite objectively easy days? Why does a seemingly comfortable life still produce sleep that never feels restorative? The body is not tired from the tasks. It is tired from the ongoing labor of suppressing an honest response to a life it does not fully recognize as safe or true. Here is the detail that changes how this should be read. The moments when 111 appears most vividly often correlate with a brief drop in that suppression. A few seconds where the shoulders loosen, where a breath goes slightly deeper than usual, where the body briefly stops bracing. People frequently notice the number in exactly those small physical openings, without realizing the opening came first. This reframes the entire relationship between the number and the body. The number is not creating the sensation of relief. The sensation of relief is creating a window wide enough for the number to be noticed at all. The same way presence itself was already shown to create a window for recognition in general. Learning to notice these physical openings, independent of the number, becomes a practical skill. A loosened jaw during a walk, an unexpected exhale during a quiet drive. These are small, reliable signals, worth paying attention to on their own. because they mark exactly the moments when the truth underneath the wrong life is closest to the surface. The body has been honest the entire time. What comes next is understanding why the mind spent so long refusing to listen to it, and what identity had to be built to keep that refusal in place. The self you built to be accepted. Carl Jung described a version of ourselves that develops early, shaped less by who we actually are, and more by what earned approval from the people whose love we depended on. He called it the persona, a mask assembled so gradually and so early that most people mistake it for their actual identity. The persona is not dishonest by design. It develops for good reason, as a genuinely useful adaptation for a child who needs connection to survive. If calm was rewarded, calm became the mask. If achievement earned attention, achievement became the mask. If being agreeable kept the peace, agreeableness became the mask. Worn so consistently, it eventually felt like simple personality. The trouble arrives in adulthood, when the persona keeps making decisions long after the original need for approval has faded. The career chosen for a parent's pride. The relationship maintained because ending it would disturb an image of dependability. The wrong life examined earlier is very often the persona's life, expertly built, dutifully maintained, and only distantly related to whatever lies underneath it. Jung called that underneath layer the shadow self, though shadow is a misleading word here, since it does not necessarily mean anything dark. It usually just means unexplored, unauthorized, and quietly waiting for permission that was never granted. Here is the detail most people miss on their first pass through this idea. The discomfort explored throughout this video is not a malfunction of the persona. It is the shadow finally getting loud enough to compete for attention after years of being reliably outvoted by the mask that kept everyone else comfortable. This is why the wrong life so often looks admirable from the outside. The persona is genuinely skilled. It performs responsibility convincingly, because it was built under real pressure to perform it well. The people around you are not wrong to be impressed. They are simply responding to the mask which was never designed to advertise what it was covering. 111 does not attack the persona directly. It creates small interruptions, brief and specific enough that the shadow can slip a signal through before the mask resumes its usual coverage. Each interruption is modest. Repeated often enough, they accumulate into something the persona eventually cannot fully talk over. Understanding this explains why simply knowing your life feels wrong has never been enough to change it. Knowledge lives with the mask. The next real question is what happens once the shadow underneath finally gets heard, and why so many people resist that moment even when they claim to want it. Why you keep looking away from it. If the shadow is finally getting loud enough to be heard, a reasonable person would expect relief at being able to hear it. In practice, the opposite often happens first. People catch the signal, feel a flash of recognition, and then look away almost immediately, sometimes within seconds. This resistance makes more sense once you consider what listening actually threatens. The persona described a moment ago is not just a personality style, it is load-bearing. An entire identity, an entire set of relationships, an entire self-image has been constructed around it for years, sometimes decades. Listening to the shadow does not simply mean admitting a preference for a different job or a different partner. It means acknowledging that a significant portion of your adult life was built on a foundation that no longer matches who you actually are, which is a far heavier admission than it initially sounds. There is also a specific kind of grief hiding inside that admission, one this video will look at more directly soon. Part of what makes people look away is an unconscious refusal to feel that grief before they are ready, because grieving a life choice while still living inside it is genuinely disorienting. Add to this the very real external cost of listening. A marriage examined honestly might not survive the honesty. A career questioned openly might create real financial instability. These risks are not imaginary, and pretending they are would be dishonest. The wrong life persists partly because leaving it sometimes requires real sacrifice, not merely imagined sacrifice. Here is the part worth sitting with. Avoidance is not evidence of weakness. It is evidence of how much is genuinely at stake and how seriously some part of you understands the size of what listening would require. The avoidance itself is a form of respect for how significant the decision actually is. This is also why the number tends to become more frequent, not less, the longer it gets ignored. It is not punishing the avoidance. It is simply persistent, arriving again and again because the underlying misalignment has not resolved itself and will keep generating the same signal until something finally shifts. Most people do not decide to listen all at once. They accumulate small moments of listening until one of them tips into something larger, a specific night or week where the avoidance finally runs out of room. That tipping point deserves its own close look. The night something finally breaks open. There is usually a specific moment when avoidance stops working, and it rarely looks like the dramatic scene people imagine in advance. No shouting match, no sudden resignation letter, no cinematic exit. Most of the time it is quiet, almost embarrassingly ordinary, and it happens alone. It might be a Tuesday night after everyone else has gone to sleep. It might be a long drive home from a gathering that should have felt joyful and did not. It might simply be another 1:11 on a clock, arriving on a night already worn thin by exhaustion, and this time landing differently than all the times before it. What changes is not the external circumstances. What changes is that the persona, worn continuously for years, finally runs out of energy to maintain its usual coverage. The shadow, which has been sending signals through the entire video so far, gets a clear opening, and this time nobody looks away in time. People describe this moment in strikingly similar language, regardless of what specifically triggered it. A sudden, unbearable clarity, a feeling of finally being honest with themselves for the first time in years, sometimes tears that seem to come from nowhere, releasing pressure that had been building quietly for a very long time. This is not a breakdown, even though it can feel like one from the inside. It is closer to a breakthrough disguised as a breakdown. The moment identity foreclosure described earlier finally reopens, allowing genuine reevaluation to begin instead of automatic repetition. Here is the detail that matters most about this moment. Nothing needs to be decided that same night. The value of the breakthrough is not that it produces an instant plan. Its value is that it removes the ability to keep pretending the wrong life feels right, which is a permanent shift even before a single external circumstance has changed. People who have gone through this describe a strange, disorienting kind of relief alongside the grief. Relief because the exhausting work of maintaining the mask has finally stopped. Grief because stopping means facing everything that mask had been protecting them from feeling. That grief deserves its own honest treatment, not rushed past on the way to a hopeful ending. Before this video moves toward resolution, it needs to sit with what is actually being lost. Skipping that step is exactly how people rebuild a second wrong life on top of the first one, often more quietly and more convincingly than the original. Grieving, a life you never actually lived. There is a specific kind of grief that has no funeral, no ritual, and very little cultural language built for it. It is the grief for a life that was never technically lost, because it was never technically lived. You cannot mourn what never existed in the usual sense, and yet the ache is completely real. This is the grief for the version of you who took the other path, the one who majored in the subject that actually mattered to them, the one who left the relationship at the honest moment instead of the convenient one, the one who spoke up in the meeting where you stayed quiet, or moved to the city you quietly wanted for years. That person never existed anywhere except as a possibility. And possibilities are strange things to grieve because they resist closure. There is no date attached to their ending, no clear moment you can point to and say, this is where they stopped being available to me. They simply faded gradually, underneath the accumulating weight of the small choices described earlier. Psychologists sometimes call this ambiguous loss, a term originally developed for grief without a clear resolution, like a relationship with someone who is physically present but emotionally absent. The parallel here is precise. The life you did live is emotionally absent from a version of yourself that is still, in some sense, present and unresolved. Here's the detail that changes how this grief should be handled. It is not evidence that your actual life was worthless. Grieving a road not taken does not require devaluing the road you did travel. Both can be true. You can genuinely love parts of your current life and still legitimately mourn a version of yourself who never got to exist. Trying to skip this grief in favor of immediate optimism is one of the most common mistakes people make right after the breakthrough described a moment ago. Rushing toward change without processing the loss underneath it tends to produce decisions made from urgency rather than clarity, which is exactly how second wrong lives get built. Sitting with this grief, deliberately and without rushing it, is what allows the next stage to be built on something more solid than reaction. It lets the unlived version of you be honored, instead of either ignored or chased in a panic. Once that grief has been genuinely felt rather than avoided, something shifts. The question stops being what was lost and starts becoming what can actually be built now, with the information the loss has finally made available. Rebuilding one honest choice at a time. After the grief settles into something workable rather than overwhelming, a practical question remains. How does a person actually move from recognizing a wrong life to building a right one without repeating the same pattern that created the mismatch in the first place? The instinct many people have is to reach for a single dramatic reversal. Quit the job immediately. End the relationship overnight. Move across the country within the month. Sometimes this instinct is correct when a situation is genuinely urgent or unsafe. Far more often, it recreates the exact mistake examined earlier, a large decision made quickly, under pressure, without room to check whether it actually reflects the shadow or simply reacts against the persona. A more durable approach starts smaller, and it starts with a specific practice. Before any major decision, pause and ask which version of you is choosing. Is this the voice that has spent years optimizing for other people's approval? Or is this the quieter voice that showed up during the physical openings described earlier? That single question, asked honestly and repeatedly, begins retraining a decision-making process that spent years running on autopilot. From there, rebuilding tends to move through small verifiable experiments rather than one sweeping transformation. A single honest conversation, instead of an entire relationship overhaul. One boundary held firmly, instead of every boundary rewritten at once. A weekend spent on the interest abandoned years ago, before deciding whether it deserves a larger place in your life. Each small experiment does two things at once. It gathers real evidence about what actually feels aligned, rather than what merely sounds appealing in theory. And it slowly demonstrates, to the part of you still loyal to the old persona, that honesty does not automatically produce the catastrophe it has always feared. Here is the detail that keeps this process from collapsing under its own weight. Progress here is rarely linear. There will be days the old patterns reassert themselves convincingly, days the safer choice looks obviously wiser again. This is not failure. It is the natural resistance of a structure that took years to build, refusing to dissolve in weeks. What matters is the direction of the pattern over time, not the perfection of any single choice. A life realigned honestly does not need to be unrecognizable from the outside. It often looks similar in its outward shape, the same career, even the same relationship, but inhabited by someone who is finally present inside it, rather than merely performing it. As this realignment continues, something else tends to shift, and it involves the very signal that started this entire process. The number itself begins to mean something different than it did at the beginning. When the number changes its meaning. People who continue noticing 111 well after the initial breakthrough often report something unexpected. The feeling accompanying the number shifts, even though the number itself never changes. What once carried a jolt of confrontation begins to feel closer to a companion checking in. In the earlier stages of this video, the number arrived mostly as interruption, breaking through autopilot, breaking through fear's disguise, breaking through a persona working hard to keep the status quo intact. Its function was disruptive because disruption was what the situation required at the time. A person deeply asleep to their own misalignment needs something loud enough to interrupt the sleep. Once someone begins actively rebuilding, using the kind of honest, small experiments described a moment ago, the number's role tends to shift from disruption to confirmation. It shows up less as a demand and more as an acknowledgement, arriving during the moments a genuinely aligned choice has just been made, rather than during moments an aligned choice is still being avoided. This shift is worth naming precisely because it can otherwise feel confusing. Did the number lose its meaning? Did the signal simply become background noise once its urgency faded? Neither explanation fits what people actually describe. The signal did not weaken. Its purpose changed because the underlying situation it was responding to changed. Here is the layer that ties this back to numerology directly. The number 1 signifies initiation, and initiation is not a single event. It repeats at every genuine threshold a person crosses, not only the first one. Early in this process, 111 marked the threshold of finally seeing the wrong life clearly. Later, it marks the smaller thresholds inside the rebuilding itself, each honest choice functioning as its own beginning. This also explains why the number rarely disappears entirely, even once the rebuilding is well underway. Growth is not a single door a person walks through once. It is a long corridor lined with smaller doors, and 111 tends to appear at each one, adjusted in tone to match what that particular threshold requires. Understanding this removes a subtle anxiety many people carry during rebuilding, the fear that continuing to see the number means something is still deeply wrong. It usually means the opposite. It means the part of you capable of recognizing thresholds is still active, still paying attention, still willing to mark the moments that matter. What remains now is the final piece, the emotional landing point this entire process has been building toward, from the very first flicker of static back in the introduction. The life that finally feels like yours. Return for a moment to the static described at the very beginning of this video, the low hum underneath an outwardly functional life, the sense of being a guest inside your own biography. That static was never random noise. It was the earliest, quietest form of the same signal this entire video has been tracing. Everything examined since then has been one continuous unfolding of that first flicker, the number naming itself specifically as 111. The compromises that built the wrong life one reasonable decision at a time, the autopilot that numbed the discomfort, and along with it, the desire underneath, the fear disguised as practicality, the body keeping honest score the whole time, the persona built for approval, and the shadow waiting patiently underneath it. The resistance to listening, the night listening finally happened anyway, the grief for the unlived version of you, and the slow, unglamorous work of rebuilding one honest choice at a time. None of that was a detour from your life. It was your life, finally being met honestly instead of managed from a distance. The wrong life was never a personal failure. It was the predictable outcome of decisions made by someone who had not yet been given permission to trust their own instincts over everyone else's expectations. That permission is what 111 has been quietly offering, appearance after appearance, for as long as it took you to notice. You do not need every piece of your life to look different for it to finally feel like yours. Sometimes it looks remarkably similar from the outside. What changes is the presence behind it, the willingness to actually inhabit the choices instead of merely performing them for an audience that was never really watching as closely as you feared. If you are still early in this process, still catching flickers of 111 in ordinary, unremarkable moments, that is not a sign you are behind. It is a sign the same recognition that eventually reaches everyone who pays attention has already begun in you, right on time, exactly when you were ready for it to start. The static from the beginning does not need to be feared. It was never a malfunction. It was the earliest, most honest voice you have finally getting loud enough to be heard, asking for nothing more than the life that was already waiting to be yours. If a clock happens to read 111 the next time you notice it, let it land differently than it used to, not as a mystery to solve, and not as a verdict on everything you have already built, simply as confirmation that the part of you capable of hearing the truth is still awake, still paying attention, and still quietly on your side.